A nurse who works at St. Jude's Hospital in Los Angeles told me this story, and when she finished recounting it, I had to sit in silence for a few minutes, because there are moments in life when injustice is so stark, so brutal, that it makes you question everything you thought you knew about human nature. This is the story of Emily Carter, a 38-year-old housekeeper who was fired from the job that supported her daughter in a way that was so cruel, it still gets to me. But even more unbelievable is what came after, because sometimes the truth has a way of revealing itself that leaves everyone on their knees. Emily had been working at Richard Sterling's mansion in Beverly Hills for 3 years. Richard was the CEO of a major pharmaceutical company, the kind of guy who shows up in business magazines, designer suits, a watch that costs more than a car, always in meetings, always busy, always important. But this story isn't about Richard, or at least, it doesn't start with him. It starts with Albert Sterling. Albert Sterling was 72 years old when Emily started working at that house. He was Richard's father-in-law, the father of his deceased wife. He'd been living in that mansion for 5 years, in a second-floor room overlooking the garden. And for 5 years, Parkinson's disease had been slowly robbing him, piece by piece, of everything he once was. Let me paint a picture of what advanced Parkinson's is like, because a lot of people don't really understand it. The tremors. Imagine trying to hold a cup of coffee and your hands are shaking so badly that the liquid spills before it reaches your lips. Imagine trying to write your name and the letters come out as illegible scribbles. Imagine your own body becomes your enemy, betraying you with every movement. But the tremors are just the beginning. The muscle rigidity makes every step a battle. Albert walked as if his joints were rusted, as if every movement required conscious and painful effort. Getting out of a chair could take him 5 minutes. Getting dressed in the morning was a half-hour odyssey. And then there's the speech. Albert Sterling had been a music professor at Juilliard, a man who spoke with passion about the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, who could identify any classic rock song with just 3 notes. But Parkinson's had stolen that too. His words came out slurred, choppy, barely comprehensible, as if his tongue had turned to lead. Imagine having a perfectly functional brain, full of thoughts, ideas, emotions, but trapped in a body that refuses to obey you. That was Albert Sterling's personal hell, and in that hell, Emily was his angel. The first day Emily came to work at that mansion, Richard made her responsibilities very clear. Clean the house, prepare meals, do laundry, keep everything spotless, and oh yes, help Albert with the basics. Nothing more, nothing more. But Emily wasn't the kind of person who does only the bare minimum. The first time she entered Albert's room to deliver breakfast, she found him sitting in a chair by the window, staring at the garden with empty eyes. The previous day's breakfast was still untouched on the side table. He hadn't even tried to eat it. Emily put down the tray and sat in silence beside him. She didn't say anything at first, just sat there. And after a few minutes, Albert turned his head slowly and looked at her. He tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out right, just broken, frustrating sounds. Emily waited. She didn't interrupt, didn't try to guess, didn't get impatient. She just waited with infinite patience until Albert managed to form the words, "I don't want to live." Like this, 9 words that took him almost a minute to pronounce. 9 words, loaded with such deep pain that Emily felt her heart breaking. And at that moment, Emily made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't just going to be his housekeeper, she was going to be his connection to humanity. During the following weeks, Emily began to learn. She learned that when Albert moved his right hand in a certain way, he was asking for water. That when he looked towards the bookcase, he wanted her to read to him. That when his eyes filled with tears, it wasn't because of physical pain, but because of the frustration of being trapped in his own body. She learned to read his silence better than others read words, but more importantly, Emily started to research on her own. She stayed late at the public library, reading about Parkinson's. She asked nurses she knew. She watched YouTube videos about therapies, exercises, communication techniques, and she discovered something that would change everything: music therapy. It turns out that there are studies that show that music, especially familiar music, can help patients with Parkinson's. It can reduce tremors temporarily. It can improve coordination. It can bring back moments of lucidity. And Albert had been a music professor. Emily started simple. One day, while cleaning Albert's room, she put on classic rock on her phone, just to see what would happen. The reaction was immediate. Albert, who had been sitting staring into space, suddenly turned his head. His eyes, normally glassy and distant, focused. His right foot began to tap to the rhythm. Just a small movement, but intentional. Emily approached him. "Do you like this song, Albert?" Albert's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were different tears. He nodded, a small but clear movement. It was the Eagles, Hotel California. And that's how it all started. Emily began to dedicate her lunch hour, which she was supposed to use to rest, to doing music sessions with Albert. She played the songs he loved. She showed him videos of concerts on her phone. She talked to him about the bands, and Albert's tremors decreased. They didn't disappear. Parkinson's doesn't work that way, but they decreased enough so that he could hold a cup without spilling it, enough so that he could eat with dignity. But Emily didn't stop there. One day, while Richard was on one of his business trips, Emily did something daring. She asked a friend to help her move the old grand piano that was covered with a sheet in the living room. They moved it to Albert's room. When Albert saw the piano, his face transformed. It was like seeing a man in the desert discover an oasis. Emily didn't know how to play the piano, but Albert did. Or, at least, he used to know. The first time Albert Sterling sat down at the grand piano, his hands were shaking so badly, he couldn't even position them over the keys. The frustration on his face was heartbreaking. He tried once, twice, 3 times. Each attempt ended in uncontrollable tremors. Albert began to cry out of pure frustration. And here's where Emily Carter did something extraordinary. She sat beside him on the piano bench. Very gently, she took Albert's trembling hands in hers. Not to stop the shaking, that wouldn't work, but to steady them, to give them a point of support. And slowly, very slowly, she guided Albert's hands to the keys. With Emily stabilizing his hands, Albert managed to press a key, a single note, a middle C, clear and pure. Albert froze. He looked at his hands, as if he couldn't believe what they had just done. Then he pressed another key, E, then G. It wasn't a melody. They were barely even loose notes. But for Albert, it was a miracle. Over the next few weeks, this became their secret routine. Every day, during Emily's lunch hour, she would hold Albert's hands and help him play the piano, little by little, note by note. Albert began to recover something he thought he'd lost forever. Not just the ability to make music, but the will to live. Emily started keeping a notebook. She wrote everything down. Albert's medication schedule, the foods he could eat without difficulty, the exercises that worked best, the classic rock songs that reduced the tremors the most, the moments of lucidity and clarity. She was obsessive with the details because Emily understood something fundamental. No one else was paying attention. Richard Sterling visited Albert maybe once every 2 weeks. 5-minute conversations, awkward, filled with silences. Richard was always in a rush, always had an important call, always had something more urgent, and Emily saw it. She saw the sadness in Albert's eyes every time Richard left the room, after barely exchanging a few words. One day, Albert managed to say something to Emily that took him almost 10 minutes to pronounce completely. "He's busy being important. I'm just busy dying." Those words stabbed into Emily's heart like knives. And that same night, Emily made another decision. She started arriving half an hour earlier to work, without asking for extra pay, just to have more time with Albert. She'd arrive at 6:30 in the morning. She'd help him get dressed, shave, to feel like a human being instead of a burden. She'd read him the newspaper. She'd help him with physical therapy exercises that she'd learned from online videos. And at the end of the day, before leaving, she'd spend another 20 minutes with him, just talking. Well, Emily would talk, Albert would listen, and occasionally managed to pronounce a few words. She told him about her daughter, Sophia, who was 15. She told him about the difficulties of raising her alone, without a father, about how Sophia wanted to study medicine, but Emily didn't know if she could afford college. And Albert listened, with an intensity that showed that behind the tremors and the slurred speech, there was a man completely present, completely alive. Months passed. Albert improved in ways that were almost impossible. For someone with advanced Parkinson's, not cured, that doesn't exist, but improved. His tremors, while still present, were less severe. He could pronounce short sentences with relative clarity. He could play some simple melodies on the piano, with Emily's help. But most importantly, he wanted to live. Emily had documented everything in her notebook. She had a record of 6 months of consistent progress. She had noted the specific songs that worked best. She had created an optimized schedule of medications, meals, and exercises. It was a labor of love, a work of pure humanity. And then Richard came home, one day earlier than expected. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3 in the afternoon. Normally, Richard would be at the office until 8, but he had cancelled a meeting and decided to stop by the house to pick up some documents. When he walked in, he heard music coming from the second floor, piano music. Someone was playing the piano. Richard walked upstairs, confused. No one in that house played the piano. He definitely didn't. And Albert hadn't been able to for years. He approached Albert's room. The door was ajar, and what he saw left him paralyzed. Emily was sitting on the piano bench next to Albert. Her hands were holding the old man's trembling hands, stabilizing them as he pressed the keys. They were playing something simple, something Richard didn't recognize. But what struck Richard the most wasn't the music. It was the expression on Albert's face. He was smiling. Richard couldn't remember the last time he had seen Albert smile. For a moment, Richard felt something resembling emotion. He almost walked into the room to say something, to thank Emily for giving Albert that moment. Almost. But then he looked at his watch. 3:15 in the afternoon, work hours, and Emily was there, using company time. Time he was paying her for to clean and cook, doing this, whatever this was. Something in Richard hardened. He paid Emily to do a specific job, not to play the piano, not to entertain Albert, to work. Richard stood there, watching, and felt something resembling indignation rising in his chest. He had hired Emily to keep the house immaculate, and yet, how many times had he found unwashed dishes or unvacuumed floors because Emily was wasting time with Albert? Well, enough was enough. Richard pushed the door open and walked into the room. Emily and Albert turned around, startled. The music stopped abruptly. "I want to talk to you downstairs," Richard said in a cold voice, looking at Emily. "Now." Emily followed Richard downstairs, with her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that tone of voice, that tone that bosses use when they've decided you've done something wrong, and there's no room for explanations. Richard stood in the living room, arms crossed, with that posture of an executive, used to people trembling before him. "I want you to explain something to me, Emily. I pay you to keep this house immaculate, to cook, clean, do laundry, not to play the piano with Albert." Emily took a deep breath. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind dozens of times, knowing that someday she would have to justify what she was doing. Mr. Sterling, with all due respect, Dr. Thompson recommended musical stimulation for Mr. Albert. It helps with his symptoms, with the tremors. I've seen a significant improvement in these past 6 months. Richard looked at her skeptically. Dr. Thompson never mentioned anything about music therapy to me. That's because you haven't been to the medical appointment since February, sir. The doctor explained it to Mr. Albert at the March consultation. I was there because you asked me to accompany him. Richard's face hardened. That was a direct hit, and it was true. Richard couldn't remember the last time he had accompanied Mr. Albert to the doctor. That's not the point, Richard said, raising his voice. The point is, I pay you for 8 hours of work each day, and I've noticed that the house isn't as impeccable as it should be, that there are dishes unwashed, that there's dust on the furniture, because you're wasting time on activities that are not your responsibility. Emily felt the injustice of those words burning her throat, but she remained calm. Sir, I arrive half an hour early every day, without charging extra time. I stay 20 minutes after my shift ends, also without charging. The hour I spend with Mr. Albert in music therapy is my lunch hour, my personal time. And as for the house, I can show you my log of completed tasks each day. I'm not interested in seeing logs, Richard interrupted. What I am interested in is you understanding what your job is here. Your job is to keep this house running. It's not to be Mr. Albert's therapist. It's not to be his companion. It's not to be his friend. It's to clean. Each word was like a slap. Emily felt her eyes welling up with tears, but she wasn't going to give Richard the satisfaction of seeing her cry. With all due respect, Mr. Sterling, Mr. Albert needs more than just basic care. He needs human connection. He needs to feel that his life still has value. Richard let out a dry, humorless laugh. Oh, so now you're a psychologist too? How convenient. Emily clenched her fists at her sides. No, sir. I'm not a psychologist, but I'm not blind either. I know what it's like to feel invisible, to feel like you're a burden on the world, and I'm not going to allow Mr. Albert to feel that way. If I can help it. There was a moment of tense silence. Richard studied Emily with cold eyes. You know what your problem is, Emily, that you get too involved, that you forget what your place is. Emily felt something break inside her. My place, she repeated in a low voice. Yes, your place. You're the housekeeper. Mr. Albert is my responsibility, not yours. And frankly, I find it inappropriate that you spend so much time with him alone. It's almost as if you're trying to manipulate him, to gain his trust for some personal gain. Those words were too much. Emily felt the anger finally overcoming her fear. Personal gain? You think I spend my lunch hours without eating? That I arrive early and stay late without pay? That I research Parkinson's in libraries on my days off for personal gain? What benefit could I possibly get from helping a sick old man that most people, including his own family, have forgotten? Watch your tone, Richard warned, but Emily couldn't stop now. Mr. Albert told me that you used to visit him every night when he first moved in here, that you spent hours talking, even though it was so hard for him to speak. He told me that you promised you'd never leave him alone. Do you know when the last time was that you spent more than 10 minutes with him? 3 months ago. Mr. Sterling, 3 months. Richard's face turned red. He was clearly furious, but there was something else in his eyes too. Guilt? Shame? I work 60 hours a week maintaining the company that pays for this house. That pays your salary, Richard retorted. I don't have the luxury of sitting around playing piano and having sentimental conversations. I'm not asking you to play piano, Emily said, her voice breaking slightly. I'm just asking you to see him, really see him, to notice that he's improved in these months, that he's eating better, that his tremors are less severe, that he has a will to live again. Richard shook his head. You know what? This was a mistake. hiring someone so young, so inexperienced. I need someone professional, who understands boundaries, who does their job without drama. Emily felt the floor disappearing beneath her feet. Are you firing me? Richard remained silent for a moment, as if he were considering his options. And it was, at that moment, that they both heard a noise upstairs, a loud bang, as if something heavy had fallen. Emily didn't wait for permission. She ran toward the stairs. When she reached Mr. Albert's room, she found him on the floor next to the grand piano. He had fallen off the bench, trying to get down on his own. Mr. Albert, Emily whispered, kneeling beside him. Are you all right? Are you hurt? Mr. Albert shook his head, but Emily could see tears running down his cheeks. They weren't tears of pain, they were tears of anguish. He had heard everything. Richard appeared in the doorway, gasping from having run up the stairs. What happened? Emily ignored the question and helped Mr. Albert sit up, leaning against the piano with gentle, practiced movements. She checked that there were no fractures, that there were no serious bumps. It's okay, Emily murmured. Everything's okay, Mr. Albert. But it wasn't okay. Nothing was okay. Mr. Albert tried to speak. His mouth was moving, trying to form words, but only broken sounds came out. The frustration on his face was heartbreaking. Emily took his hand. Quiet. Breathe deeply. Take your time. Mr. Albert closed his eyes, breathed 3 times, and then tried again. Don't fire her. 3 words that took him almost 30 seconds to pronounce. 3 words laden with supplication. Richard stood paralyzed in the doorway. Mr. Albert continued, each word a monumental effort. She is the only good thing I have left. The silence in that room was crushing. Emily felt her heart breaking. Mr. Albert, don't worry about me. You focus on getting well. But Mr. Albert shook his head vehemently. Don't leave me alone, he managed to say. Please. Richard cleared his throat uncomfortably. Dad, no one is going to leave you alone. I'll hire someone more professional, someone with medical experience. I don't want professional, Mr. Albert said with surprising clarity. I want Emily. Emily watched Richard, who appeared completely bewildered by the situation. He clearly hadn't expected Albert Sterling to get involved. Look, Dad, Richard began, his voice softening slightly. Emily is a nice person, I'm sure, but you need specialized care. You need someone who knows what they're doing. She does know, Albert insisted. She knows more than any nurse. She knows me. She understands me. Richard glared at Emily with a mix of frustration and disbelief. You've been filling his head with ideas, haven't you? That's why he's defending your job so fiercely. Emily stood up, trembling with indignation. I haven't filled his head with anything. Love can't be manufactured, Mr. Sterling. Your father-in-law appreciates me because I treat him like a human being, not a burden. Because I listen when he tries to speak, instead of interrupting him. Because I care if he's sad or if he's in pain. Enough, Richard snapped. I've made my decision. He approached Albert and spoke to him as if he were a small child. Dad, Emily can't work here anymore. I'm going to hire a professional nurse who can take care of you properly. Albert began to cry openly. No, he repeated over and over. No, no, no. Richard turned to Emily. You have until the end of the day to gather your things. I'll pay you for the entire month as severance. Emily couldn't believe what she was hearing. You're firing me in front of him like this, after 3 years of service, after 3 years of mediocre work and crossing inappropriate boundaries. Yes, Richard said coldly, and frankly, you should be grateful I'm even paying you severance. Emily looked at Albert, who was still sobbing on the floor. She wanted to tell him that everything would be all right, that she would find a way to keep visiting him, to take care of him in some way, but she knew it would be a lie. Richard won't let me see you again, will he? Emily said softly. Will you? Richard didn't respond. He didn't need to. Emily knelt one last time beside Albert. She took his trembling hand in hers. I want you to remember something, Albert. You are not a burden. You are a valuable man, full of wisdom and experience. These months with you have been a gift to me. It has been an honor to know you." Tears streamed freely down Albert's face. "And I want you to keep playing the piano," Emily continued. "Even if it's just one note a day. Promise me you'll try." Albert nodded, unable to speak. Emily stood up, looked one last time at Richard, and left the room. She gathered her few belongings from the kitchen, her apron, her coffee thermos, a photo of Sophia that she had taped to the refrigerator, and her notebook. That notebook where she had documented 6 months of meticulous care, where she had noted every small victory, every improvement, every moment of progress. Emily stared at the notebook in her hands. She considered leaving it for Richard, showing him all the work she had done, all the research, all the love she had put into caring for Albert. But she knew it wouldn't do any good. Richard had already decided who she was in his mind, a simple housekeeper who didn't know her place. Emily left the notebook on the kitchen table and walked out the back door. She didn't know that notebook would change everything. She didn't know that in 3 weeks, Richard would be on his knees begging for her forgiveness, because the truth has a curious way of coming to light. And when it does, it leaves no room for excuses or justifications or pride. The first 3 days after Emily's dismissal were the worst of Albert Sterling's life. He wouldn't eat, he wouldn't speak, he wouldn't move from his chair by the window. He just stared at the garden with empty eyes, as if something inside of him had been permanently extinguished. Richard hired a professional nurse, Mary Ellen Lopez, with 15 years of experience in geriatric care, impressive credentials, impeccable references. Exactly the kind of professional Richard had insisted Albert needed. Albert rejected her from day one. When Mary Ellen tried to help him get dressed, Albert refused. When she tried to give him his medication, Albert turned his head away. When she tried to initiate conversation, Albert closed his eyes and remained silent. "It's nothing personal," Richard explained to Mary Ellen after the first frustrating week. "My father-in-law is just going through an adjustment period." But it wasn't an adjustment period. It was something much deeper. Albert was on strike, a silent strike against the injustice of having the only person who made him feel human taken away from him. By day 10, Albert had lost almost 7 pounds. His tremors, which had improved so much with Emily, had returned with alarming intensity. He could no longer hold a cup. He could no longer pronounce more than 2 or 3 words in a row. It was as if 6 months of progress had been erased in 10 days. Richard noticed, of course, but he told himself it was only temporary, that Albert would eventually accept Mary Ellen, that everything would return to normal. He told himself many lies in those days. By day 14, Mary Ellen quit. "With all due respect, Mr. Sterling," she said as she packed her things, "your father-in-law doesn't need a nurse. He needs someone who cares. And frankly, I don't know if you are that person." Those words stung Richard deeper than he wanted to admit. He hired another nurse, then another. By day 21, he had gone through 4 professional nurses. They all quit. They all said basically the same thing. "Albert isn't cooperating because he doesn't want to live like this." And then came the crisis. Day 22. Richard received a call at 3 in the morning from the 5th nurse, Guadalupe. "You need to come immediately. Albert isn't responding." Richard drove through the deserted city with his heart in his throat. When he arrived, he found paramedics already in the house. Albert was being loaded onto a stretcher. "What happened?" Richard asked, his voice cracking for the first time in years. One of the paramedics, a young man with a serious expression, responded. "It appears he stopped taking his medication several days ago. His blood pressure is dangerously low. He's severely dehydrated. We're taking him to St. Jude's Hospital in Los Angeles." "How do you mean he stopped taking his medication?" Richard glared at Guadalupe, who looked on the verge of tears. "He was spitting them out," Guadalupe explained. "I tried to give them to him, but he would hide them under his tongue and spit them out when I wasn't looking. I didn't realize it until tonight when I found them under his pillow. Richard felt the world tilt beneath his feet. At St. Jude's Hospital in Los Angeles, the doctors were blunt. Albert Sterling was in a downward spiral of self-neglect that could kill him in a matter of days if it wasn't reversed. It wasn't just the Parkinson's. It was severe depression. It was a loss of the will to live. "Your father-in-law is letting himself die," Dr. Herrera said, without mincing words. "And frankly, Richard, unless you find out what changed in the last 3 weeks, I don't know if we can save him." Richard sat in the hospital waiting room, his head in his hands. For the first time in years, he wept. He had been so sure he was doing the right thing, so sure that Emily was crossing boundaries, that she wasn't professional, that Albert needed specialized care. But what if he had been wrong? Richard returned to the empty Beverly Hills mansion at dawn. He walked aimlessly through the silent rooms. Everything felt cold, sterile, like a museum instead of a home. He went up to Albert's room. The grand piano was still there, covered in dust. The sheet music scattered on the stand. Richard sat down on the piano bench and noticed something. There were damp stains on the keys, dried tears. Albert had been trying to play alone. He had been trying to recreate those moments with Emily, and he hadn't been able to. Richard felt something break in his chest. He went downstairs to the kitchen looking for coffee, and that's where he saw it. On the kitchen table, partially covered by the day's newspaper from when Emily left, was a blue notebook. Richard picked it up, curious. There was no name on the cover, just a date, March 15th, 2025. He opened the first page, and what he read changed everything. Care log. Albert Sterling, started by Emily Carter, March 15th, 2025. Objective: document progress, symptoms, and methods that work to improve Albert's quality of life. The first entry was from 6 months ago, just when Emily had started seriously caring for Albert. March 15th. Consultation with Dr. Herrera. Albert was diagnosed with Parkinson'S 5 years ago, but symptoms have worsened significantly in the last year. Doctor mentioned that cognitive and physical stimulation could help slow the rate of decline. Suggested music therapy, given Albert's background as a music professor. Research more about this. Richard froze. Dr. Herrera had mentioned music therapy. Emily hadn't lied. He continued reading. March 18th. Spent 3 hours at the public library researching Parkinson'S. Found studies on music therapy. University of Toronto did research in 2018 showing that familiar music can reduce tremors temporarily in 60% of patients. Must be music that the patient knows and loves. Going to try with classic rock? That was Albert's specialty. Richard turned the page with trembling hands. March 20th, first informal music session. Put on the Beatles. Hey Jude on my phone while cleaning the room. Albert reacted immediately, eyes focused, right foot tapped to the beat. Tremors decreased noticeably during the 4 minutes of the song. When the music stopped, tremors returned, but Albert was more alert, more present. This works. Need to do more. Page after page, Emily had documented everything, every small experiment, every discovery, every failure, and every success. March 25. Got a friend to help me move the grand piano to Albert's room while Richard was on a business trip. Hope he's not upset. But I think Albert needs this more than a spotless living room, needs a decorative piano. Richard remembered noticing that the piano had been moved. He had assumed he had ordered it, and then forgotten. March 28th. Albert tried to play the piano for the first time. Tremors too severe, couldn't place his hands on the keys, cried in frustration, broke my heart. Tomorrow I'm going to research hand stabilization techniques. March 30th, found a video on YouTube about how to help Parkinson's patients perform fine motor tasks. Key is external stabilization. Tried holding Albert's hands while he played. It worked. He managed to play 3 notes, C, E, G, saw hope in his eyes for the first time. Richard couldn't stop reading. The notebook was full, page after page, of meticulous notes. Optimized medication schedules 8 a.m. Levodopa 100 millimeters with light breakfast. Note, Albert tolerates medication better if he eats an apple beforehand. Does not tolerate citrus in the morning. 2 p.m. Levodopa 100 millimeters with lunch. Note, ensure lunch includes protein. Pasta alone makes him feel dizzy. 8 p.m. Levodopa 100 millimeters with dinner. Note, dinner should be early. If he eats after 8 p.m., he has trouble sleeping. There were lists of foods that Albert could eat without difficulty. Textures that worked, ideal temperatures. Foods that work. Pureed vegetable soup, lukewarm temperature, not hot. Albert can sip it without burning himself even with tremors. Mashed banana with soft granola. He likes the texture and can eat it with a large spoon. Shredded chicken in broth, easy to chew, requires no cutting. Foods that don't work. Meat in chunks, requires too much coordination to cut and chew. Raw vegetables. Albert gets frustrated trying to spear them with a fork. Anything with loose rice, grains slip off the fork, causes frustration. Richard felt tears welling up in his eyes. Emily had thought of everything. Every minuscule detail that made Albert's life easier, more dignified. He continued reading. Music therapy progress. Week 1-2, listening to music only. Tremor reduction during music, approximately 40%. Week 3-4, introduction to piano with hand support. Albert manages to play 5 or 8 notes consecutively. Week 5-6, Albert can play simple melodies with support. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, complete. He cried with joy. Week 7-8, starting more complex pieces. Albert remembered the fingering for Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin. His fingers remember even when his body doesn't cooperate. Week 12. Albert can play up to 30 seconds of music with support before fatigue causes severe tremors. This is incredible progress. And then Richard came to an entry that shattered him completely. May 10th. Albert Sterling spoke about Richard Sterling today. It took him 15 minutes to form complete sentences, but what he said was important. He said, "My son-in-law was a good man. When his wife died, he promised me, Sin, that he would take care of me, that he wouldn't leave me alone. But now, he's so busy being important that he's forgotten how to be good." I don't blame him. The pain changed him. Richard had to put the notebook down and walk to the window. Tears were now flowing freely down his face. Albert Sterling didn't blame him. Even after being emotionally abandoned, even after being treated like another piece of furniture in the house, Albert Sterling did not blame him. But Richard blamed himself. He took a deep breath and returned to the notebook. There was more. The last entries were from the week before Emily Carter was fired. September 8th, Albert Sterling asked about my daughter Sophia today. He wanted to know about her studies. I told him that Sophia wants to be a doctor, but I don't know if I'll be able to afford university. Albert Sterling tried to say something about helping, but I told him, no, I'm not doing this for money. I'm doing it because Albert Sterling deserves to be treated with dignity, period. September 10th, Richard Sterling almost caught us. During a music therapy session today, I had to make up an excuse about why the grand piano was uncovered. I'm worried that one day he'll fire me for moving things without permission, but it's worth the risk. Seeing Albert Sterling play, seeing the joy on his face is worth any risk. And the last entry, written the day Richard confronted her, September 15th. Today, Richard Sterling saw me, playing the piano with Albert Sterling. I know a confrontation is coming. I've rehearsed what to say 1,000 times, but the truth is simple. I love this old man, as if he were my own grandfather, not because he pays me, but because I see in him everything my grandfather was before Alzheimer's took him away. I couldn't save my grandfather, but maybe I can give Albert Sterling what my grandfather never had: dignity, companionship, love. If I'm fired today, at least I know that these 6 months, it meant something. See, I know that Albert Sterling's had 6 months where he felt human. Again, that is enough. Richard closed the notebook with trembling hands. He sank into a kitchen chair and cried like he hadn't cried since his wife's funeral. Emily hadn't been crossing boundaries. Emily had been saving Albert Sterling. Emily had been doing the job that Richard should have been doing. And he had fired her. He had accused her of manipulation, of incompetence, of having ulterior motives, when all Emily had was pure and simple love for a forgotten old man. Richard opened the notebook again and searched through the final pages. There, hung in small, careful writing, he found something more. Emergency contact information. Emily Carter, 310-555-0123, address 123 Main Street, apartment 4B, downtown LA. Emily had left her information, just in case Albert Sterling needed her. Even after being unjustly fired, even after being accused of manipulation, Emily had left a way to contact her, in case Albert Sterling went into crisis, because she understood something that Richard had forgotten, that loving someone means being there, even when it's not convenient, even when you're not getting paid, even when it costs you something. Richard looked at the clock. It was 7 in the morning. He could go to St. Jude's Hospital to see Albert Sterling. He could sit by his bed and tell him that he would find another professional nurse, or he could do something different. He could do the right thing. Richard picked up his phone and dialed the number that Emily had left. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and then a cautious voice. "Hello? Emily? This is Richard Sterling." Silence on the other end of the line. "I know. I have no right to ask you this. I know. I was horrible to you. I know. I don't deserve your consideration. But Albert Sterling is in the hospital. He's giving up on life. And I read your notebook." Emily's voice came in a whisper. "How is he?" "Bad. Very bad. The doctors say he's lost the will to live." Richard took a deep breath. "Emily, I read every word of your notebook. I read about the music therapy, about the meal schedules, about the progress you documented, about how you came in early and stayed late without getting paid, about how you did research on your days off." More silence. "And I read what you wrote about me, about how Albert Sterling so doesn't blame me for abandoning him." Emily's voice broke. "Albert Sterling loves you, Richard. He always talks about you, about what a good man you are, about how the pain of losing his wife changed you, but that underneath it all, you're still good." Those words were like knives. "I don't deserve that grace," Richard said. "Not from Albert Sterling, and certainly not from you. But I'm calling you to beg you to come back, not as a housekeeper, as what you always were, the person who cares about Albert Sterling when no one else does." Emily didn't respond immediately. "I need to know something first," she said. "Why did you call me? Out of guilt? Because no other nurse worked out?" Richard could have lied. He could have said something noble, but Emily deserved the truth. "For all those reasons," he admitted. "Because I feel guilty, because no nurse worked out, but also because I read your notebook and I realized something. You care about Albert Sterling in a way that I forgot how to do. And he needs you. He needs someone who sees him as a person, not as a patient or as a burden. I realize now that it was always you." There was a long pause. "I'm going to the hospital," Emily said finally. "But I'm not going for you, Richard Sterling. I'm going for Albert Sterling." because he doesn't deserve to suffer for the mistakes of others. I know, Richard responded. And Emily, thank you. The call ended. Richard sat in the empty kitchen, holding the blue notebook, that notebook that contained more love and dedication in its pages than everything he had shown in the last few years. And he knew that when he got to the hospital, he would have to do something that he had never done well. He would have to apologize on his hands and knees. Emily arrived at St. Jude's Hospital at 9 in the morning. She had taken 2 buses and the subway to get there. She was still wearing her uniform from her new job, cleaning offices at night. She hadn't had time to change. When she got to Albert Sterling's room on the 3rd floor, she found Richard sitting in a chair next to the bed. He had the blue notebook in his hands. Richard looked up when Emily entered. His eyes were red, swollen. It was clear that he had been crying. "You came," Richard said, his voice hoarse. Emily didn't answer him. She walked right past Richard and went to the bed where Albert Sterling lay, connected to several monitors. The old man was asleep, looking fragile and tiny beneath the crisp white hospital sheets. Emily gently took Albert's hand. "Albert, it's me. It's Emily." Albert's eyes fluttered open slowly. For a moment, he seemed confused, disoriented. Then, his eyes focused on Emily's face, and he began to cry. These weren't silent tears. It was a deep, heartbreaking sob, as if something inside him had finally shattered and been released. "I'm here," Emily whispered, stroking his hand. "I'm here. Albert, I'm not going to leave you." Albert tried to speak, but he couldn't form the words. He just squeezed Emily's hand with all the strength his weakened muscles could muster. Emily turned to Richard, who was still sitting in the chair, watching the scene with a devastated expression. "What did the doctors say?" Richard cleared his throat. "That he's severely dehydrated and malnourished. That he stopped taking his medications almost 2 weeks ago. That his depression is so severe, it's affecting his physical health." Emily nodded, her face grim. "I need to speak with Dr. Herrera. I need to know exactly what was missed in these 3 weeks, so we can correct it." "Whatever you need," Richard said immediately. "Anything." Emily finally looked at him directly. "Why did you really call me Richard?" Richard stood up. "I could say something noble, but you deserve the raw truth. I called you because I'm a coward who didn't know how to face that I hurt someone I love because of my own pride and blindness. I called you because I read your notebook and I realized you've been better family to Albert in 6 months than I have in 5 years. He paused, his voice cracking. "I called you because Albert is dying, because I pushed away the only person who made him want to live, and that makes me the worst kind of man." Emily studied his face. "You read the whole notebook? Every word, every note, every meticulous observation?" Richard looked at the notebook in her hands. "This isn't just a medical log, Emily. This is a testament of love, the kind of love I forgot how to give." The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the beeping of the medical monitors. "If I come back," Emily said slowly, "and I say if, there are conditions, whatever they are," Richard replied without hesitation. "First condition, Albert isn't my responsibility. He's our responsibility. You're going to spend at least 1 hour each day with him, not working on your laptop in the same room, not checking emails while he watches TV. 1 real hour, present, connected." Richard nodded. "I accept. The second condition, you're going to attend all of his medical appointments from now on. You're going to meet his doctors. You're going to understand his treatments. You're going to make informed decisions about his care." "I accept," Richard said again. "Third condition." Emily took a deep breath. "Albert needs to know he's loved, not just tolerated, not just cared for out of obligation, but genuinely loved." And if you can't give him that, then you need to be honest, so we can find another solution. That condition hit Richard like a punch to the gut. I do love him, Richard said, his voice barely a whisper. I know I haven't shown it. I know I've been terrible, but I do love him. I loved my wife with everything I had, and when she died, I didn't know how to be around her father without all the pain coming back, so I pushed him away. I worked 60, 70 hours a week, so I wouldn't have to feel, and in the process, I abandoned the only piece of family I had left. Tears were running freely down Richard's face now, but that's no excuse. Pain doesn't justify cruelty. Pain doesn't justify abandonment. I was so focused on my own suffering that I didn't see the suffering I was causing. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. All right, I'll come back. The relief on Richard's face was immediate. But there's one more thing, Emily added. Anything. You're going to apologize to Albert on your knees, and you're going to explain to him exactly what you did wrong and how you're going to change it. Richard paled slightly. Now, Richard looked at Albert, who had been watching the entire exchange with teary but attentive eyes. Richard walked over to the bed and slowly, with careful movements, he knelt beside it. Albert, Richard began, his voice trembling, I don't know if you can forgive me. I don't know if I deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know I'm sorry. I'm sorry I abandoned you emotionally. I'm sorry I was so consumed by my work that I forgot I had family here, at home, who needed me. Albert was watching him with absolute attention. I'm sorry I fired Emily. She was right about everything. About the music therapy, about the care, about you deserving to be treated with dignity and love. And I was so blinded by my own pride that I couldn't see it. Richard's voice broke completely. But more than anything, I'm sorry I haven't been the man I promised my wife I'd be. I promised her I'd take care of you, that I'd never let you be alone. And I broke that promise in the most cruel way possible. Albert raised his trembling hand and placed it on Richard's head. We all make mistakes, Albert managed to say with great effort. The important thing is what you do after. Richard took Albert's hand and held it against his face. I promise you, I'm going to change. I'm going to be present. I'm going to know you the way Emily knows you. I'm going to be real family. Albert nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks. Emily watched the scene with tears of her own. She had come prepared to be cold, to maintain professional distance. But seeing Richard finally break, finally be vulnerable, finally be real, was something she hadn't anticipated. I'm going to go talk to Dr. Herrera, Emily said softly. You two need some time together. As Emily left the room, Richard remained kneeling beside the bed, holding Albert's hand. I've failed you in so many ways, Richard said, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life making up for it. I promise. Albert squeezed his hand. Stay, he managed to say. Just stay. And Richard stayed. For the first time in years, he cancelled all his meetings for the day, turned off his phone, and simply stayed beside Albert. The following days were transformative. Emily didn't return as just the housekeeper, but as a care coordinator with a salary 3 times higher and the authority to make decisions regarding Albert's treatment. Richard insisted, and Emily finally accepted. Working closely with Dr. Miller, Emily developed an intensive recovery plan, specialized nutrition to regain the weight he'd lost, physical therapy to rebuild his strength, and of course, classic rock therapy to revitalize his spirit. But most importantly, Richard kept his promise. Every single day, without exception, he spent at least an hour with Albert. At first, it was awkward. Years of emotional distance and don't just vanish overnight, but little by little, they learned how to be together again. Richard would read the newspaper to Albert every morning. He'd tell him about his work, but this time, he listened when Albert offered his perspective with his few, carefully formed words. Then, One afternoon, 3 weeks after Albert left St. Jude's, Emily suggested something. "Mr. Sterling, have you ever considered learning to play the piano?" Richard looked at her, surprised. "Me? I have absolutely no musical talent." "You don't need talent," Emily said with a warm smile. "You just need to be present. Albert would love to have someone to play with." And so, Richard Sterling, the CEO of a multi-million-dollar pharmaceutical company, began taking piano lessons. He was terrible at first. His fingers were clumsy, uncoordinated. He hit the wrong notes constantly. But Albert, sitting beside him, with Emily gently guiding his hands, encouraged him. "Better," Albert would say after each disastrous session. "You're improving." And the strange thing was, Richard was improving, not just at piano, but as a human being. He learned patience. He learned that progress isn't always measurable in numbers and charts. He learned that sometimes success isn't a signed contract, but a smile on the face of someone you love. 6 months later, something miraculous happened. It was a Saturday afternoon. Richard and Albert were sitting together at the grand piano. Emily watched from the sofa, smiling. "Let's try this together," Richard said. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star. You play the melody, and I'll do the simple accompaniment that Emily taught me." Albert nodded. His tremors were still there. They'd always be there, but they were manageable now. Richard counted. 1, 2, 3, and they played together. Not perfectly. Albert lost the rhythm in the second line. Richard hit 2 wrong notes, but they finished the entire piece. When the last note faded, they both turned to look at each other, and they smiled. Emily quickly grabbed her phone and snapped a picture. 2 generations, connected by 88 keys of ivory and ebony. That night, while Emily was preparing dinner, Richard approached her in the kitchen. "I want you to know something," he said. "I've been thinking a lot about what you wrote in your notebook, about your daughter, Sophie, and how she wants to study medicine." Emily tensed up slightly. "Mr. Sterling, I already told you, I didn't do this for the money." "I know," Richard interrupted gently. "But Albert and I have been talking, and we agree. We want to establish an educational fund for Sophie, not as payment for your services, but as family, because that's what you are now. Emily, family." Emily felt her eyes welling up with tears. I can't accept that. It's already done," Richard said firmly, but gently. Albert insisted. He said his wife was a doctor, and that it would be an honor to help another young woman fulfill that dream. Tears were streaming down Emily's face now. I don't know what to say. Just say you accept, and say you'll bring Sophie to visit us soon. Albert wants to meet her." Emily nodded, unable to speak. There was a moment of comfortable silence. "Thank you, Emily," Richard said finally, "for not giving up on us, for seeing something good in me, even when I couldn't see it myself, for teaching me that real success isn't measured in money or power, but in the lives you touch and the love you give." "I just did what was right," Emily replied. "No," Richard said, "you did something extraordinary, and that made all the difference." A year later, the nurse at St. Jude's Hospital, who told me this story, saw something that made her smile. Albert Sterling arrived for his regular checkup, walking with a walker. Yes, still with tremors. Yes, but walking, accompanied by Richard on one side and Emily on the other. And when Dr. Miller asked him how he was feeling, Albert smiled broadly. "I feel loved," he said with surprising clarity. "And that's the only thing that matters." This story was told to me by that nurse 3 months ago. She told me that it had deeply affected her, because it reminded her of something we all forget sometimes, that no matter how much money you have, how much power you accumulate, how important your job is, at the end of the day, the only thing that really matters is how you treat people, especially the vulnerable people who depend on you. Emily Carter could have accepted the termination and moved on. No one would have blamed her. She had been treated unfairly, accused of horrible things, fired without consideration, but she chose to respond with grace. She chose to return when she was called. She chose to give Richard a chance to redeem himself, and that choice saved 3 lives. Albert's, who found a reason to live again, Richard's, who learned how to be human again, and Emily's own, who discovered that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, always brings unexpected blessings. Before I finish, I want to share something with you. If this story touched your heart, if it made you reflect on how you treat people in your lives, I invite you to leave a super thanks, not for me, but as a reminder to yourself that you're going to value the people who take care of you, who serve you, who are there day after day, doing invisible work. The Emilys of the world are everywhere. They're the nurses who care for our grandparents. They're the teachers who see potential in our children when no one else does. They're the employees who do their jobs with excellence, even when no one is watching. And they deserve to be seen. They deserve to be valued. They deserve to be treated with dignity. And for those of you who are listening to this and feel like Emily, who feel like you're giving everything and not receiving recognition, I want you to know something. Your work matters. Your compassion matters. Your humanity matters. The world needs more people like Emily, people who do the right thing, not because it's easy, not because it's profitable, but because it's right. Keep being that light. Keep being that kindness. Because eventually, the truth always comes to light. And when it does, justice arrives in ways we never imagine. I'd love to know, have you ever been unfairly judged for doing the right thing? Or have you had an Emily in your life? Someone who showed you love when you needed it most? Share your story in the comments below. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who's struggling to do the right thing under difficult circumstances, please share it with them. You never know when a story can shift someone's perspective or give them the strength to keep going. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, true power doesn't come from how much you have, but from how much you give. See you in the next story.